Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Land 8 virtual conference sponsored by Innova Furnishings. We'd like to take a moment and thank our sponsor for this webinar series, Innova Furnishings. Innova's mission is to design and manufacture beautiful, comfortable outdoor furniture that helps communities come together. Here's just a quick glimpse at what they could do. They are tremendous supporters of the landscape architecture profession. Please take some time this week to check them out at innovafurnishings.com, and perhaps they could be a fit on your upcoming projects. Thank you, Innova. This session will be led by Kurt Culbertson of Design Workshop. Throughout his 40-year career, Kurt has been a recognized thought leader in landscape architecture, land planning, and urban design disciplines. He's passionate about the firm and the profession, and is committed to bringing integrity, depth of inquiry, and excellence to all we do. As chairman and CEO, he has been instrumental in our vision and growth. Kurt is a leader in the field of evidence-based design and is dedicated to the measurement and heightened performance of landscapes spanning environmental, social, and economic factors. Every year, the Landscape Architecture Foundation selects projects to highlight in the Landscape Performance Series case study briefs. And under Kurt's leadership, 12 of their projects have been featured, more than any other firm. A profuse and influential writer, Kurt has published articles that span the profession, including community engagement, practice-based research, landscape history, and urban ecology. In recent years, he has turned his attention to the issues of environmental equity, elevating the discourse and championing the creation of ASLA's Environmental Justice Professional Practice Network. Kurt's peers hold him in the highest esteem, and has been recognized with the industry's top accolades. In 2016, he was awarded the American Society of Landscape Architects Medal, the highest honor in the profession. He is past chair of the ASLA Council of Fellows and the Cultural Landscape Foundation, as well as a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners Council of Fellows. A proponent of lifelong learning, Kurt has mentored hundreds of young professionals with the firm and beyond. He holds a doctorate in landscape architecture from Edinburgh College of Art, a Master of Science in Real Estate from Southern Methodist University, and a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from Louisiana State University. He was a Fulbright Scholar at Wirtschaft Universität in Vienna, Austria. Thank you so much, Kurt, for taking the time to be with us today. A quick note about those in US and Canada looking for continuing education credit. This is an approved course, so be sure to take the exit quiz in order to prove that you came to this session. So that'll be posted around the 50-minute mark. So keep an eye on the chat in order to copy and paste that link into your browser and access the quiz. Also, when you leave the webinar, there will be a link for a post survey. You can click that link as well. So there's two ways of accessing the quiz. If you'd like to ask Kurt a question, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the Zoom screen, not the chat. So the chat is just for housekeeping, but if you would like to ask Kurt a question, use the Q&A chat. Everyone on the call can upvote popular questions, so we'll ask the most popular ones. So if you like a question you see, hit the like button and I'll shoot it to the top of the list, and we can make sure that Kurt answers those first. Thanks so much for everybody joining us today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask Kurt to share his so that he could begin his presentation. Thank you.
Got it?
Don't see your screen yet.
You have it, Matt?
Don't see your screen.
Okay, hang on. There you go.
Great. Okay, perfect.
This is called Old Dogs and New Tricks. Good morning from the mountains of Colorado. I appreciate everyone's attendance today. I always reflect whenever I give a talk. I look back over 42 years of practice and wonder why I give talks. What I've actually concluded is the audience are really my guinea pigs. They're a way for me to test ideas and explore possibilities. So it's hopefully a learning exercise for you, but also I know it will be and has been a learning exercise for me. Sure, all of you are having various levels of anxiety about the current crisis, and for me, putting this presentation together has been a way of working through some of those feelings and thoughts. If you're listening this morning because you're looking for answers, I don't know that I will hold out a lot of answers, specific conclusions about what we as a profession should be doing, but I do want to share with you some initial thoughts and feelings and musings on the topic, and I hope most importantly to share with you a conceptual framework that might guide our actions moving forward, rather than depending upon specific tactical solutions. You saw in the opening slide in the background a subset of this map. If you may be familiar with John Snow and what is often called the ghost map in the cholera epidemic in London in 1854, John Snow, who is generally considered the father of epidemiology, noted the addresses and locations of homes in London where people were coming down with the disease. And what he concluded is that the source of the infection was the Broad Street pump, and found that there was a cluster of victims around a reasonable distance. The people who walked to that pump gained that water. And what Snow was successful in doing was drawing a relationship between disease and geography, and more specifically disease and landscape, and thinking about starting what is often called the field of disease mapping, understand the spatial relationship between disease and geography and landscape, and that is what we're talking about in large measure today. I had to ask myself, you may have as well, what exactly is a virus? How does it differ from a bacteria, which is a single cell organism? A virus, as I've read over the last 100 years or so, has variously been considered a living organism. I think the current thinking is that it is something more akin to a chemistry lab or a chemistry set, but it is an agent that can only multiply by drawing upon the DNA of living cells. And it is also, COVID-19 in particular, is what is known as a zoonotic virus. A zoonotic virus is a virus that passes from animals to human. And in the last 100 years, there have been about 60 of these viruses, 60 viruses that have passed from animals to humans. Some of you know Ebola, HIV, and so forth. So it is clearly something that we've experienced before and something we will continue to experience in the future. David Quammen in 2012 wrote this book, Spillover, which talked about the ability for viruses to migrate from animals to humans and create the next human pandemic, what the kind of thing that we're experiencing now. And in his book and in his other writings, he's pointed to the fact that the loss of biodiversity reduces predators, allows certain species, bats, rats, humans, to multiply in great numbers, and facilitates the transition from animals to humans of viruses. This is why you are hearing so much about the wet markets in China, the selling of wild animals for food, and so forth. So we're dealing with a biological phenomenon, an ecological phenomenon, and certainly appropriate for us to be considering on Earth Day. Some writers have said that cities are shaped by disease, and there's certainly evidence of that. Athens in 471 BC, in the midst of the Peloponnesic Wars, was set by a typhoid epidemic. It was devastating to the population, and many say it was the principal cause of the decline of Athenian democracy. In Paris, the time of Haussmann, the great boulevards, some would argue that these boulevards were designed by Napoleon so that his troops could control the population, but others have said Napoleon was sensitive to the fact that there was disease and slums and squalor in the city, and the lack of fresh air and light and open space, And it was this concern about disease and the history of disease that in the city of Paris that led to that. The great walkways and promenades along the Thames in London are a byproduct of the 1854 cholera epidemic that John Snow was also concerned with. The Spanish flu in New York in 1918 led to reforms of the tenement system in that city, and certainly the yellow fever epidemic in Memphis and New Orleans and other cities up and down the Mississippi led to the creation of combined sanitary sewer systems for the first time in those cities. So the challenge that we face now, understanding how disease will shape our future living environment, is not a new one. It has been with us for centuries and will continue. There has also been a lot of conversations of late about the relationship of man and nature, and is this virus a product of nature getting even with man for the destruction we brought to the earth? There are even been memes and musings on whether man ourselves, humans ourselves, are in fact a virus, and it's certainly something to consider, but I think this question of man and nature, man apart from nature, is really being tested like it never has before. We all have various feelings about this. Judeo-Christian tradition would suggest it began with a man and woman in a garden, and all went pretty well until somebody took a bite of an apple, and then all hell broke loose. It's also to challenge you to ponder your beliefs around evolution and whether we have evolved from apes, whether we continue to evolve. And fortunately now, as you can see on the right, we have reached the highest form of the human species, the landscape architect, which gives us some faith. Man has always created. The creation of art. Millennials ago, we have been builders for millennia, but we are not the only builders. Beavers and birds and termites and bees all shape the environment and so forth. So we are not unique in our ability to shape nature. So I would suggest that man is an organism, just like all the other organisms on the planet. We are a species. We coexist and are not man apart from, and our ecologies, our urban ecologies, are an important part of the overall patch and pattern of the natural environment. I want to talk to you, if you're not familiar with the idea of patch dynamics. This is my cottage in South Carolina. You will see in the foreground the sweet gum tree that was down by the last hurricane, missed my house by 6 feet. I learned the hard way that sweet gums are probably the weakest wood and most vulnerable in a hurricane landscape, but hurricanes are a form of disturbance. They set the landscape in motion and movement, but disease is a form of disturbance as well. If you look at this slide, you can see several things. You see what appear to be natural woodlands. You can see agriculture in the form of what I believe is a pine plantation. You see a railroad track and a roadway cut through. You see what is probably a landing strip and a power line. These are disturbances on the landscape and part of human intervention. But I would contend that design can also be a disturbance. I don't know if you recognize this map, but this is a plan of Seneca Village. It was the African-American community that was forcibly removed in order to make way for Central Park in New York. Sometimes design can be a disturbance, an ecological disturbance, and the actions of man certainly ecological disturbances. Now, I think I'll give this example. I think you've all participated in the design of ecological patches if you've ever done a planting design. This is a residence we worked on in Austin, Texas. You can see the site of a small bungalow being built in the city, and an existing stand of trees, much of which is red cedar, but also much of which was damaged or killed by major drought. The removal of those dead and diseased trees, and then the need to craft a new planting plan, the kinds of things that Piet Adouf designed at Millennium Park in Chicago, thinking about the arrangement of plant materials compositionally, ecologically, hydrologically, topographically, thinking about how those plant materials will bloom over time and the pattern of those plants, and then beginning to create a landscape and install a landscape that can grow in over time and hopefully create something quite beautiful. Now, for those of you who have done a planting design or installed a planting design, I know that you know that all of these plants stay exactly where you intended them to in the planting design, right? You pick them carefully, they all thrive, they all stay within bounds. Perhaps you use steel edger to separate the grass from migrating into the planting and so forth. Now I'm being a little absurd because you do know that what happens is not all of these plants are going to live. Some of them are going to thrive more than you thought they would, and they are going to move and migrate in search of habitat and finding the optimum habitat in which to live and thrive. And I would suggest, and this may be a controversial theory to you, but I would suggest that cities, the urban environment, are in fact comprised of ecological patches. That just like the forest or the woodlands or the wetlands or marsh near your home, a city is a composition of ecological patches, and those patches, just as in the natural environment near your home, are in constant motion. We have tried for millennium, certainly for centuries, to write rules and laws to try to freeze those patches in place. Cerda's urban design principles for Barcelona, for example, the design of the ideal superblock, codes in which to freeze the movement of ecological patches based around our current conceptualization of the ideal urban form. Now, it's fitting that on Earth Day, we might ponder the work of Ian McHarg. We've all, I think, applied his principles in some form or fashion, the idea of mapping social and environmental, hopefully economic factors in planning, generally, at least my understanding of McHarg's work, generally greenfield sites, and looking at a whole range of categories to determine the optimum location for new development, the crafting of a plan, and hopefully using McHargian principles to guide the new development that'll follow. But what I've not been able to find is really an example of McHarg applying these methodologies to the existing urban fabric. And so in the course of my dissertation, I took two cities, St. Louis and New Orleans, and sought to uncover the city's environmental history. So I was really inspired by Eric Sanderson's work in New York. If you've read a remarkable book called Mannahatta, Eric took historic maps of the city of New York, partnered with a spectacular computer graphics expert, and developed a rendering and map of what the historical ecology, what the pre-existing ecology of Manhattan would have looked like prior to human settlement. And so I said, let's take St. Louis. It's a city I've had the pleasure of working in quite a bit. My oldest daughter went to school there. Let's take St. Louis as an example, and let's understand what the historical ecology of that city might be and how it might be guide to policies around vacant land in that city. Roughly 22% of all of St. Louis is now publicly owned vacant land because of the decline of population in the city. It is it is the site of Cahokia across the river in East St. Louis, but also extending into the site of St. Louis, which in 1300 was the largest city in North America, a Native American city, larger than London and Paris at the time. I took historic maps of the French explorers. I georeferenced those to locate the sites of historic forts and Indian mounds relative to the current fabric of the city. And then I used those historic maps to create, as Sanderson had done, an understanding of the ecology of St. Louis before European settlement, and to understand how future flooding, mega floods, might also impact the city. And what I realized was that St. Louis, interestingly enough, is actually an excellent site from a McCargian perspective as a site for the city. And so why was it that 22% of all of the land of the city was vacant land? Why were people leaving the city? And borrowing from the writings of E.O. Wilson, I developed what I called a habitat quality model for Homo sapiens. And that was the idea that humans prefer to live in closest proximity to opportunities. Opportunities might be jobs, opportunities might be medical care, maybe public parks, maybe museums or sports fields or access to nature and so forth. We want to live in closest proximity to opportunities, and we want to live as far from risk as we can, right? Rather logical. Let me live close to the good stuff. Let me live far from the bad stuff. And it's sort of one of the reasons, if you have friends or perhaps yourself have a second home, why second homeowners are fleeing New York and moving to their second homes to get away from the risk that they perceive now, and perhaps greater proximity to open space. So let's flesh that model out a little bit. As I said, the opportunities can be things like parks and museums and employment and transportation. And at least in my model, the risks fall into three categories. They are geophysical, the things we know, like topography and slopes and subsidence and flooding and sea level rise, but they also include geophysical risk like disease. They can include social risk like crime, unemployment, so forth. And they can also include technological risks. That could be cancer risk or respiratory risk or proximity pollution like brownfield sites and so forth. And in a simple way, to think about it is, where do you want to live in the city? Because I like to say, generally, you want to live uphill, you want to live upwind, and you want to live upriver. You want to live uphill because, as we all know, what flows downhill. You want to live upwind because pollution can blow across the city, and you don't want to live where it concentrates. That's why the better end, the more expensive real estate in London is in the West End. The lower income is in the East End because of prevailing winds, but also the Thames flows downhill from west to east. So you want to live away from industry and away from pollution, right? And what I found in St. Louis, and it's relevant to this question of COVID-19 and spatial equity, is I found that there really wasn't a level playing field, that all environmental factors, all opportunities and risks are not equal, and they certainly are not equally spatially distributed. And so this is why I think we have a growing awareness of this. This is why questions of environmental justice, which in my mind, a simple definition would be distance from or freedom from environmental threats or risk, pollution, flooding, sea level rise, so forth, proximity to those opportunities we talked about. So I mapped the vacant lands. If you can see these little gray dots all over this map of St. Louis. And what I found is that they were dramatically concentrated in the north of St. Louis, which also happens to be overwhelmingly African American. And interestingly enough, has been shaped by policy, and that patterns of vacant land, and as you'll see in a minute, patterns of disease in St. Louis are highly shaped not so much by those geophysical factors that McHarg was concerned with, but by human policies, by governmental policies and decisions we've made. This is a redlining map of St. Louis. In the 1930s, there were maps created for almost every American city that determined the high-risk areas, where banks would loan money, where banks would not loan money. You know ecologically that ecosystems are in stress when they are cut off from access to nutrients, and some of those nutrients are in fact access to investment funds and money. Those patterns persist. It's what ecologists would call patch persistence. High quality habitat, Central Park East and West, tends to persist as high quality habitat. Low quality habitat can also persist over time and generations. Why is that true in St. Louis? Well, one of the things you might wonder is why in St. Louis is the north side of St. Louis predominantly African American? Why is that where poverty is concentrated? It's because in the early years of the 1900s, many of the industries of St. Louis were emitting enormous quantities of air pollution, of smoke and smog. The concept of zoning was emerging in the United States. The industry was zoned on the north side of the city near the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi River, right? So industry by design was concentrated in the north of St. Louis. What followed that in about 1910 were zoning of the city, and in particular racial zoning, which required African Americans to also live on the north side of the city adjacent to industry and adjacent to the pollution that they put out. In 1896, the case in New Orleans, Plessy versus Ferguson, institutionalized the concept of separate but equal. Racial zoning was overturned by the Supreme Court in 1917. We're persistent creatures. We started using racial covenants to implement the same kind of restrictions. In many cities, the last racial covenants were not removed from deeds until the 1970s. We had patterns of racial blending, the redlining maps I mentioned. Racial covenants were overturned in 1948. Fair Housing Act and the Voting Rights Act tried to further level the playing field in the late 1960s, but these patterns persist. You can see on this map a very strong dividing line between red dots, which are predominantly white people, and blue dots, which are predominantly African American. The line that separates those red dots and the blue dots in St. Louis is known as the Delmar Divide, right? A very strong demarcation line between socioeconomic groups. Now, this map is rotated from the last one you saw, but what you can see here is that the predominant concentration of COVID-19 cases in St. Louis are in North St. Louis and in South St. Louis, which tends to be also blue-collar neighborhood, home to many new immigrant and ethnic groups. The oranger, more yellow corridor that runs east to west through the city, called the Central West End, tends to be more white, and again, lower concentrations of disease. So the conclusion you might draw from this is that disease, certainly there are comorbidity factors, as you've probably read, questions of low-income people of color do not have access to adequate health care. There are unequal distributions of parks and open space. There may be unequal distribution of access to information, of the internet, a whole range of things. But the patterns of disease of the COVID-19 virus overlay almost perfectly, city by city, these patterns of economic inequity that have existed in many cases by design in our cities. So if we take this understanding, applying McHargian principles to new city. How might that work? How might that would that inform us, our work as landscape architects? This is an example of the Houston Arboretum. Like the example I gave of the residents in Austin, it's a landscape that was dramatically impacted by drought, dramatically impacted by hurricanes. It had become over time largely a monoculture of pine forest, heavily disturbed landscape. Again, that idea of environmental disturbance, drought, hurricane, disease. The original instinct was to try to replant the Arboretum and bring back the trees. But if you understand the historical ecology of Houston, you realize that Houston sits pretty well at the juncture of the coastal prairie of Galveston, the Gulf Coast, at the confluence of the piney woods, the big thicket of East Texas, and at the hill country landscape. And so we said, maybe there's an opportunity to actually create a more diverse landscape, a more didactic landscape that speaks to all of these diverse ecologies that come together around Houston, and not plant all those trees back, but create opportunities for meadows and open spaces. Very detailed analysis. I'd like to think McCard will be proud, looking at actually half-foot topography because of the micro topographic conditions that influence hydrology and vegetative growth of slope and canopies. The creation of suitability analysis for what types of habitat might grow in each of these environmental conditions. And then the creation of a series of alternative plans, trying to determine which scheme had the greatest edge condition, which of these schemes would have the greatest potential for bird and other wildlife, and then beginning to illustrate those schemes and landscapes, and then creating a new landscape, a far more diverse landscape. And recall our principle of zoonotic viruses and the fact that the lack of biodiversity increases the movement of viruses from animals to human. This idea of a more diverse landscape ecology in the heart of the city is essential to public health. And then, of course, a range of green stormwater techniques and so forth that demonstrate a more ecological sound approach to landscape in the city. So now how do we merge these ideas? Park system open space plan for Vancouver, British Columbia. We were fortunate the client specifically asked for a brief that we address the question of spatial equity. We chose to define spatial equity, and by spatial equity, remember, we're talking about access equitable, not identical, but fair access to opportunities and freedom from risk. We defined equitable access as equitable access. Can I get to a park by transit, by bike? Do I have safe walking routes to parks, right? The quality. A park is not a park. A green polygon on a map is not the same for everyone. Some of you have probably done park system master plans where you draw a 15-minute walking distance circle around a park and you figure out where the gaps in the circles are and you say, that's where I need a new park. But that doesn't address the question of quality. I may have brand new playground in one playground and in one park, and I may in another neighborhood of the city have a playground that hasn't been renewed or updated in 25 years. And then are there questions of inclusivity? Do people feel welcome? Are there economic barriers to access that create a challenge as well? So we looked back, going back to my question of large circles around existing parks, to Harlan Bartholomew's 1927 park system plan for Vancouver. And we said, is there another way to look at it? And so what we did was we took an intermediate study that had been done that looked at walking distance to parks. So a little more sophisticated than Bartholomew's circles, right? And we said, let's map these in GIS and let's determine where are the park access gaps, where, based on recreational surveys at recreation centers and so forth, Where are we finding the greatest demand for low barrier access to recreation? If you know Vancouver, if I get out west on the peninsula, you know, out toward Pacific Spirit Park, those are where the wealthier neighborhoods are. Those folks might live on a half-acre lot or a 1-acre lot. They may have a pool in their backyard. They may be able to afford to go to an athletic club, right? They may have greater access to healthcare and nutrition and so forth. On the other end, where you see that concentration of demand for low barrier recreation are the lower income neighborhoods of the city. They are also the neighborhoods that, curiously, as in St. Louis, border the port of Vancouver, the industrial lands of Vancouver. And then where are the gaps in the urban forest canopy? Those were the three metrics we used. The urban forest is heavier on the west end, where larger homes are located, where people have the ability to have trees in their yard and so forth. The urban forest is much less prevalent. In the east end, we composite those together, and that gives us a clear direction for initiative zones. Where do we need new parks? Where do we need focus on urban tree canopy? How do we create a more equitable landscape for the people of Vancouver? And by doing so, create more human health, more environmental health, and a byproduct, not in this case a particular notion of the design. How do we create a healthier environment that's less prone to disease? And how do we do that in a way that articulates a 100-year vision for the people of Vancouver? What we found is, and you probably encountered this in your own work, is that you may put forth bold ideas, but someone said, a bureaucrat says, that's not happening on my watch. You can address that after I retire. That's too controversial. Or a politician says, you can't do that on my watch. I'm up for re-election. You know, you can do that later. Or someone said, we can't possibly afford that. That won't fit in our budget cycle. And what we found is that if we put forth the 100-year big idea, that suddenly the bureaucrat relaxes and says, yeah, that's okay. That'll never happen on my watch. I'm not worried about it. The politician said, oh, I'll be president of the United States or premier of Canada by then. It's not a concern for me. And someone said, well, you know, we can't afford it in this next 5-year capital cycle, but in 100 years, yeah, I can believe this might happen. And so it really loosens up the possibility for people to think big. Now, my friend Kofi Boone at North Carolina State has coined a term that I think is very appropriate called racialized topography. The idea that the wealthier, candidly whiter people tend to live on high ground, people of color, those of lower income on low ground that's subject to flooding. We're working now in Beaufort County, South Carolina, which contains Hilton Head, if you know that geography, working on a comprehensive plan. And one of our mandates is to develop a comprehensive plan that addresses question of climate change and sea level rise. And in doing so, we have chosen to try to address this question of spatial equity as well. And you can see from these maps where higher and lower income areas of the county are located. The wealthy folks, generally the white community, live on the barrier islands of Hilton Head, where they have access to the beach and ocean views. People of color tend to live more inland, where they're more distant from those amenities, but also on lower topography generally, and not on the high bluffs of the barrier islands. Curiously, you can see the concentration of minority populations illustrated in here in yellow, and in particular, the concentrations of African Americans, of minorities in the town of Yemassee along the river there. And if you then map on a zip code by zip code basis the location of COVID-19 cases in the county, the highest concentration that you can see are in the African American community of Yemassee, lower concentrations in the more upscale communities of Hilton Head, but also high concentrations in Beaufort and Bluffton, where you have a lot of old people like me living. So again, the relationship of disease, of geography, and of spatial equity. So what does that mean in terms of actions? Well, if you've followed, I suspect you all have, the literature around COVID-19, you're aware that there are much higher incidence of the disease that occur in areas of poor air quality, that air pollution, which disproportionately impacts populations of color, lower income populations, can have a devastating impact on someone's tendency to catch COVID-19. Similarly, proximity to pollution of different types, of other kinds, can have increase one's proximity potential to catch COVID-19. We had the pleasure of working on an urban greening plan in Fontana, California, that you can see here outlined in white. It's in the Santa Ana Basin, subject to the winds, one of the highest concentration of air pollution in the LA Basin. Our goal was really, our assignment was to try to figure out how to revise or update the city's landscape standards, principally to try to improve mobility. Let's have shadier streets. Let's have shadier sidewalks. Let's get people out and walking around. We took it upon ourselves to try to say, well, wonder if there's a way for landscape to actually improve air quality. We've all heard the phrase, the parks are the lungs of the city. We said, is that really true? And can we really put that into action? Can we think systematically about this? And so we mapped the existing tree canopy. We looked at land surface temperatures. Urban heat island varies dramatically across that landscape. We looked at the California EnviroScreen, EPA EnviroScreen data, and determining where there are existing brownfield sites and so forth. And then we looked at pedestrian cyclist collisions. Where are there public safety issues? We also benchmarked against comparable or other communities in the larger LA area. You can see Fontana has a tree canopy of 0.36 of the land area. Beverly Hills, at the other end of the spectrum, substantially greater. Tree canopy follows income. Fontana has large areas of lower income, neighborhoods of color, right? It also, I haven't found this mapped yet by zip code, it also has the greatest number of COVID-19 cases in San Bernardino County. Disease follows poor habitat quality, right? We began to look at how trees and landscape might capture particulate matter, PM 2.5, PM 10, nitrous oxide, and so forth. How can we improve air quality in the city, right? And one of the things we discovered is different plant species are better at catching these particulates, better at improving better at capturing ozone, sequestering carbon than others. And so the tree list for Fontana becomes shaped not just by low water use plants or plants that are attractive to birds and other wildlife, but which trees have the greatest impact on air quality. One of the things you find is many trees actually emit volatile organic compounds and can in fact contribute to air pollution. So which of the trees that are actually have a negative impact on air quality, and which of the trees have a positive impact on air quality, and can we improve those, and by doing so increase human health? Can we preserve existing trees? And you can see here some of the metrics. The impact on carbon sequestration, for example, varies by species and by size of trees and so forth. And can we develop a pattern of green streets for the city that are prioritized based on issues of spatial equity? Let's give trees, new trees, improved streets to the neighborhoods that need it the most, develop standards for different land uses, and illustrate those. So one of the positive outcomes of this pandemic is that we are seeing remarkable things happen. You have heard about the improvements of water quality in the lagoons of Venice. You have probably heard out your window the chirping of birds like you've never heard them before. We have a quieter world. We have cleaner water. We are having cleaner air. So, you know, Ron Manuel has a great line, never waste a good crisis. So the question is, how are we going to use this crisis to imagine a better world? You may have seen this plan by Studio Projekt in Vienna, Park de la Distance. I think it's a think piece. It may be an actual proposal for a park covered with hedges in the form of a human footprint that allow us to all move through open space and maintain our 6-foot social distance. Very clever, very interesting idea, but candidly, it strikes me that this is a response to the symptoms of COVID-19, to the impact of a pandemic that's already in place, not a response to the systemic challenges of environmental quality, of habitat quality, and of spatial equity that leads to pandemics in the first place. We have seen in Berlin and Bogota and New Zealand and Oakland, I believe, is closed on a pop-up basis, 72 miles of roadways to cars to try to find ways to expand the public realm and create opportunities for people to be outside, to recreate, and maintain social distancing. Social distancing, the crisis gives us an opportunity to totally reconceptualize the public realm and reallocate streets from cars to people in a massive, massive way. We maybe see other forms. The airport in Singapore by PWP. Will we, because of social distancing, see a renewed interest in landscapes moving indoors in order to provide access to nature if we cannot be outdoors in public as we once were? Conversely, we may see programmatic elements like symphony halls move from buildings indoors to outdoor amphitheaters where we can maintain greater degrees of access to open air and greater social distances. The speculation can be significant, and you, I'm sure, all have interesting ideas we would all love to hear. Can we create a quieter world? Can we say, gosh, it's been so wonderful to have the lack of automobile noise and traffic noise and so forth. Can we begin to design landscapes like this one at the airport in Amsterdam that attenuate noise and give us a quieter world? Can we seize that opportunity? Can we reconceptualize our work as the design, our work as landscape architects, as the design of quality human habitat? Quality habitat for humans and other species. Can we develop an ecology of the city? You've probably seen many photographs like this, right? Coyotes howling on the streets of San Francisco, monkeys in the streets of Bangkok, sheep on the streets in Wales, right? Aristotle said nature abhors a vacuum. When one species moves from a piece of habitat, other species quickly follow and occupy that habitat. We have retreated as humans from our own habitat as we sequester indoors, as we work from home, and our fellow species are moving back into this urban habitat with a vengeance, right? I would suggest they may never leave. This is a wonderful book, Understanding How the Urban Jungle Drives Evolution. There is a great deal of empirical research that suggests that species, deer and raccoons and possums and birds are evolving in response to their life in the urban habitat. If you take that theory to its logical conclusion, it means that humans are also adapting as well. So I would suggest these points in summary. Remember, COVID-19 is a zoonotic virus, migrates from animals to humans, and the lack of biodiversity increases the migration of viruses from animals to humans. So, as it is always, but with increasing emphasis, our goal needs to be to protect the natural environment and biodiversity. I would suggest that we need to view our work as a creation of quality human habitat. Indeed, the creation of quality habitat for all species. Many of the ideas that I've observed that have come forth are driven by the ideas of the separation of social distancing as a new design criteria. That's true, but I worry that it may cause us to think too tactically and not systematically enough in addressing these problems. What is the form and the nature of a city and an urban landscape that promotes human health, that promotes the health of all species? What are the systematic thinking that needs to be put in place? How do we work with healthcare as professionals to bring health science to landscape architecture, not just our physical health, but our mental health? How do we provide habitat for the homeless and those in need? Remember, poor quality disease follows poor quality human habitat. That's why you see the concentrations of COVID-19 in particular components of our society. Do we ask the environmental justice question on every spatial equity on every project we work on? How can we expand the public realm? I think James Cormer said one of the things we'll see are bigger parks so people can maintain greater social distancing. Well, clearly we need more parks, we need bigger parks, but we need them equitably distributed so we all have access to them. Can we consider pandemics and park designs? The city of Austin, for example, contemplate where field hospitals might be located and how parks and certain kind of medical interventions might contribute to that. You saw in Fontana how we might design for air quality as a way to contribute to public health. Can we design for noise attenuation? And can we envision the future cities we desire and fight for them? Theodore Parker, a transcendentalist, says the arc of the mortal universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We are in a very interesting time. And let us remember that in our work, the provision of environmental justice and spatial equity is a critical part of what we do. And with that, I will end and open it up to questions. Looks like we have quite a few.
We do. Thank you, Kurt, so much. Very informative and timely presentation. Let's get straight to some of these questions for you. First question comes from Kona Gray, another one of our speakers in the series. Thanks for joining, Kona. Says, it seems very clear from history that red line planning, racism, and pandemics exacerbates environmental justice. How can landscape architecture solve social issues in light of the multiple factors that work against vulnerable populations? Yeah,
it's a really good question. Randy Hester and I, if you know Randy, who's been working on questions of social justice, environmental justice his entire life, and has really been the leader in this for decades. Randy made an important distinction to me between issues of social justice and environmental justice. And social justice, in my mind, would be the broader questions of racism. It would be questions of a living wage. It would be questions of universal health care and so forth. And we certainly, as citizens, I think, have a role in forming our own conclusions and advocating for those kind of equitable solutions. But Randy said, as landscape architect, our focus is really on environmental justice. That's the realm where we can influence solutions on our daily work as opposed to our daily activities as citizens, right? And so, you know, like I say, I think if you are tasked with doing a parks and open space plan for your community or any community, is spatial equity an integral part of the plan? Are you addressing whether those parks and open space, bike trails, greenways, and so forth, are they equitably distributed in the community? Similarly, are those opportunities equitably distributed, right? And, you know, it raises very interesting questions. You know, in recent decades, we've seen a huge emphasis in cities on, I'll call them trophy parks, these large multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar parks and cities that in many ways can soak up, I mean, they're wonderful places, but in many ways they can soak up valuable limited dollars from donors, from parks departments, in creation of trophy parks that are certainly raise the profile of the community, but we have to make sure that's not happening at the expense of parks, open space, trails, mobility in lower income communities.
Right. Next question kind of follows that same vein. Often it is found that quality park spaces result in an increase in home and property values, which you mentioned, of those adjacent areas, and that drives out lower income communities. So how do you recommend that we as landscape architects best balance the cost to design and construction quality of park spaces with real estate values? How do we match up quality parks?
That's an excellent question. Do urban parks lead to gentrification? I think, to put that simply. You know, we had the pleasure of working on Lafitte Greenway in New Orleans. It's a 3.6 mile long corridor through about 8 neighborhoods in the city. It crosses through a transect of the city. We had an astonishing low budget in order to create that greenway, and yet it has led to gentrification. The data is still not entirely in. Certainly looking for this next census to understand how the demographics along that corridor have changed, but there is the notion of what some have called just green enough, which is, again, going back to my example of trophy parks, of rather than building something so precious that it's clearly going to attract people to move into that community, is to build a quality park, but build it at a level that provides recreation and open space for the adjacent residents without it being so precious that it drives gentrification. How you find that number and whether that's the right strategy, I'm not exactly sure. But what does strike me is that if there is spatial equity, if access to parks and open space and those opportunities we talked about are equitably provided around the city, or if those risks, freedom from risk, is equitably distributed throughout the city, then there may be less tendency for those patches to move, right? That's essentially what gentrification is the movement of one socioeconomic patch from one area of the city to the other. So if we design for spatial equity on a system-wide basis, as well as a site-wide basis, but we have to think about it on a system-wide basis, or I think some level of gentrification will continue.
All right. Next question. After COVID-19, how do you think the spatial planning will change to respond for the next epidemic?
Well, I think one of the things I've been reading in anticipation of the presentation and thinking is, one of the points that was made is that we need to be diligent, and we need to be thinking about what the impact of COVID-19 will be on cities. But we also need some time, and we need science, right? Some in our society do not believe in science, apparently, but I do. We need science to inform our decision making, and we have to be careful that we don't design expensive responses to what could be outlier situations, right, that would preclude other options. We need solutions that are adaptable, that are resilient, that can respond to changing economic, environmental, social conditions, and so forth. So we need resilient solutions. I think it may be too early to put all our chips on one solution at the moment, right? And so if we are thinking about cities as a form of an ecology, if we are putting our research and science on understanding that ecology, the urban ecology, if we are thinking systematically about the equitable distribution of opportunities and risk, right? I think we'll get there, because, you've probably seen a lot of articles. Is this the end of public transit? Is this the end of density, right? And those are the kinds of things that could be knee-jerk responses that aren't considered thoughtfully with data before us, right? I think some of the data I see coming out of Asia suggests that density and transit are not proving to be substantive contributors to the spread of the disease if other actions are taken, testing and so forth.
All right. Let's jump to this one. What big or 100-year ideas, like you mentioned, do you think are currently much more possible than ever before, especially perhaps a dramatic shift in our human habitat?
Well, I think you know, maybe I'll say the one I'd like to see. I think part of the notion I was pursuing my dissertation was, could we use McCargian ideas, as I would say, to surface the underlying ecology of the city, use it as a framework for reshaping the city over a century or more, right? Okay, so New Orleans is a little over 300 years old. St. Louis is right about there. You know, as I like to say, it took us 300 years to get here. We're not going to solve it in 10, right? It's probably going to take us 300 years to get to a healthier New Orleans or a healthier St. Louis or wherever city you're from. So you got to think on a real long time scale of analysis, at least as long as the city has been around, in my view, right? And so I do a lot of work on right-sizing streets around the country on corridor planning and design, right? And almost every street in North America is oversized for the amount of traffic it carries. Not everyone, but many, many, many of them. And so I'm really heartened by the kinds of things I see coming out of Oakland and New Zealand and Berlin and so forth, as I could see a dramatic reallocation of the public realm to create more space for bikes and peds and non-motorized mobility and away from automobiles. And that, you know, one of the things we found, I got a text from our client in Vancouver yesterday. Vancouver is adding 150,000 people in the next 20 years, right? That is going to place enormous demand on the recreational resources of the city, right? So first response is, well, we need a bond issue. Let's go buy more land and create more parks in Vancouver, right? Anybody know what the price of an acre of land is today in Vancouver? $100 million. So going out and buying more land in Vancouver to create parks, it's an option, and it might happen a little, but it's not the silver bullet, right? And so what we tried to do there was reconceptualize the entire public realm as recreational space, right? Streetscapes, the roof of buildings, right? Putting recreation centers on the ground floor of buildings, right? Totally reconceptualize every inch or square meter, every inch of the public realm as open space and recreation, right? And I think these times suggest that, because we may not have the financial resources to be able to, to simply buy our way and buy new open space to meet the challenge. So that's one thing I could see as a big idea, is to take an entire city and draw the proper size of all the streets and then go systematically to change them.
All right. I think we're going to take one more question and then we will wrap it up. So let's see. COVID will inevitably bring about questions surrounding open space as a healthcare tactic in cities if it has not already. Do you think healthcare companies and providers will join the conversation about how to best thwart COVID and other diseases in the cities in which they have a major stake?
Well, that's a really good question. Wow, that is a really good question. I don't know who asked that, but if you'd email me, I'd love to talk to you about that. Businesses want certainty. In my experience, I've been at it a while. Businesses want certainty and they want reduced risk, right? And if I were an insurance provider, investing in public health would be in my economic best interest, right? If I can reduce the number of claims because I'm dealing with a healthier population, if I can reduce these big spikes in claims that are caused by a pandemic, it would be in my economic, it'd be in the enlightened economic self of most businesses and certainly of insurance companies. So they should, and I think there are some examples of where they are doing that, but we probably need to find the ways to, the vehicles for them to be able to invest, right? I think it's a very, very logical thing for them to do. But certainly university, I use the analogies, universities, most enlightened universities have got the whole town and gown thing. They realize that land around the quality of development, the low crime, et cetera, around their campus is in their self-interest. And many universities are investing in revitalization of the neighborhoods that surround the campuses. The same would logically be true to me for hospitals and other healthcare providers.
right. Well, with that, we will end it. We went a little long. Thanks everybody for sticking around, and thanks Kurt for your time and very informative presentation. We appreciate you being here with us very much. The quiz has been posted. The link has been posted in the chat, and I believe when you exit, it will send you straight there for those of you in the attendance looking for CE credits. All attendees, thanks for being here. And one last time, want to majorly thank our main sponsor, our only sponsor, ANOVA, for helping us put this whole event on and providing great resources for landscape architects. With that, we will sign out, and everyone join us again tonight, 5 p.m. We have a panel on social media and how your firm and practice can use social media to amplify your work and your voice. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
See you next time. Thanks, Kurt.
And wash your hands like a surgeon.
Yes. Good advice. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.